It's insane, but coming up on this next Tuesday, Wisconsin is still planning to have their primary, despite the fact that they are taking other measures to limit people's contact with each other. Wisconsin has ordered residents to stay at home, shuttered non-essential businesses, and banned all public and private gatherings of any number of people, but is still planning to proceed with an election on Tuesday. Now, bear in mind, every other state that was supposed to hold a presidential primary contest in late March or April has postponed their elections or switched to vote by mail. So, Benjamin, we could have a primary on Tuesday as the number of coronavirus cases and deaths is still increasing on a day-to-day basis. What do you think about the decision by Wisconsin?
I think it's consistent with what we saw in Florida, and now we see people are dying in Florida, right? I think it's highly irresponsible, but it also shows a level of desperation that the establishment has. They want to bring this to an end as quickly as possible, and that itself is a story, right? In the face of this global pandemic, in which the United States is becoming the new epicenter, they are more concerned with saving their own power than they are actual policies that would help solve this pandemic. And those policies are the policies of Bernie Sanders. And again, it's not because Bernie Sanders is so great. It's that he's advocating for the right things. But instead of being more concerned about that, they're focused on how can they expedite this process, even if it means sending people to the polls to get sick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess we're supposed to be like nice and not point out the cost in human lives that this will create, but it's not even hypothetical. Like Florida, right. We know people became infected with coronavirus as a result of going to the polls, and that, like, who could possibly say that holding an election in person, having people congregate in a time when we don't want two people standing next to each other in a Starbucks, we're going to have people line up at places we're going to have senior citizen poll workers and things like that, that is going to lead to infections. It's going to lead to deaths. There's already 1,550 cases in Wisconsin. There have been 25 deaths. Like, I don't see how you can possibly make the case as one of the officials in Wisconsin that this is the moral, the ethical, even the pragmatic thing to do when you can postpone it and still have the vote, but under safe circumstances.
Right. It's gaslighting of the highest order. And this is what we've seen across the country. We knew what was happening at the beginning of March. Right. We had an idea. Let me put it in better context. We had an idea of what was coming. But by the time we got to Super Tuesday 2, right, when Florida was voting, this is the type of rhetoric that they were using, that it's the moral thing to do. But the moral thing to do is to stay alive and not help spread a pandemic that is costing so many lives. So I just think it's a deep moral failing that's being sold to us as the moral thing to do. And I think that's the quintessential definition of gaslighting.
Yeah. It's just a disastrous decision to make. Now, thankfully, there are some who are trying to push them in the right direction. A statement was put out from the Bernie Sanders campaign saying people should not be forced to put their lives on the line to vote, which is why 15 states are now following the advice of public health experts and delaying their elections. We urge Wisconsin to join them. He also called on states to extend early voting once the election had been pushed back and work to move entirely to vote by mail. As of right now, it seems crazy, but the Biden campaign has not put out a statement on Wisconsin. So they're at least not encouraging people to do it like they did in the last go-around of primaries, but they are not actually putting any pressure. The presumptive nominee is not putting any pressure on Wisconsin to not go ahead with this.
That's because the people who surround Joe Biden do not care, as evidenced by the fact that Super Tuesday 2, they sent people to the polls. They encouraged them. And now they're just going to be quiet about it. They're more concerned with getting power. And here's a distinct difference, right? So as this pandemic started taking root in our country, Bernie Sanders started shifting his campaign to focusing solely on the pandemic, the policies that would help us survive the pandemic, and even raising money on behalf of people for the pandemic. And what we see on the other side of the aisle is politics as usual. You see Joe Biden running the campaign as usual. He's still sending out his regular fundraising emails. He's still having these positions that go counter to what we need right now, right? He's avoiding the conversation on Medicare for all when people are literally dying. This is not hyperbole, but people have died because they did not have insurance and could not be seen at there's one young man who died at a urgent care facility because they would not see him because he didn't have insurance. And so we have one campaign that's running a campaign that's people-centered, focused on helping us survive this pandemic, and then we have Joe Biden.
Yeah, and we've got more to say about him. But before we move on, what do you think about the news broke today that the Democratic National Convention that is going to be pushed back just by a month, which still seems kind of optimistic at this point.
Yeah.
You know, I know that conversations are going on in DC right now about what needs to be done to prep for the possibility that we're not going to be entirely out of this even for the general election. I know that they want funding to do vote by mail in time for the general election, but Republicans in the Senate and Donald Trump are like vigorously opposed to that. Trump even admitting that the Dems are trying to create too much voting out of this. What do you think is going to end up happening with the general election?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to vote by mail. See, what I don't think people have come to terms, at least not our political establishment. It has not come to terms that we are in a different world right now than we've ever seen. There will be no convention in what it was supposed to be June, so now they're saying July. No, there's not going to be a convention in July. We'll still be feeling the impact of this virus. We'll still be trying to get it under control. I mean, for all intents and purposes, we should shelter in place until there's a vaccine, and that's like a year from now. So the establishment is not being transparent with people, both the Democratic and Republican establishment. They're trying to get away with politics as usual as much as they possibly can because it protects their power. But there's some radical changes that have to take place just for our sheer survival. And part of it is, how are we going to carry out an election in the middle of a pandemic?
Exactly. And not expect that far more people are going to die. I mean, the idea that we'll have a vaccine by then seems basically impossible. Now, it's possible that, you know, people will have developed some level of natural resistance to it as a result of a large percentage of the population being exposed to it at that point. That seems like a worst case scenario. But they really need to get on this. I'm glad that there are some politicians like Bernie Sanders who are pushing for that. And not saying that we should start thinking about it in a few months, but that we should be putting the infrastructure in place right now. Infrastructure, by the way, which would be great even after we're no longer thinking about the coronavirus, we're way past it, you know, making sure that we enshrine actual in reality access to democracy, to your vote actually counting right now. That would pay dividends in future elections and help to fight back against some of the massive suppression that we have in many states that predates, you know, by a long time the coronavirus. Like we could really kill two birds with one stone here if we take this seriously.
Right, but that would mean we're dealing with some good faith actors, right?
Yeah.
That would mean that we're dealing with a system that honestly just didn't know that there was a way we could do it better. In fact, that they thrive on the fact that they can make voting as difficult as they possibly can. And that's one of the biggest things that this coronavirus has exposed to me. Actually, it was before the coronavirus. I think it was the Michael Bloomberg issue that really exposed to me that we're surrounded by bad faith actors that understand exactly what we need to solve our problems, but they never intended on solving those problems in the first place.
Yeah, because we call them problems, but they're not problems for everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. It's their way of maintaining power.
Yeah, exactly. For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.